Harold Chung woke up that Tuesday morning the same way he had for the past 30 years. The old alarm clock beside his bed rang at exactly 6:30, and he reached over with his weathered hand to turn it off. His joints creaked as he sat up. On the edge of his small bed, looking around his tiny apartment, the walls were bare except for one faded photograph of young soldiers in uniform, standing together and smiling despite the mud on their faces. At 84 years old, Harold had learned to take his time with everything. Getting dressed wasn't as easy as it used to be. His fingers, once steady enough to handle a rifle in freezing temperatures, now trembled slightly as he buttoned his shirt. But today was different. Today he was putting on his best suit, the same dark blue one he'd worn to his wife's funeral. 15 years ago, he walked over to his small dresser and carefully opened the top drawer. Inside, wrapped in an old cloth, were his military medals. Harold held them up to the light coming through his window. The metal had lost some of its shine over the years, but they still meant everything to him. He pinned them to his jacket one by one, remembering the day he'd earned each one. The newspaper was still folded on his kitchen table from 3 days ago. Harold had read the same article at least 20 times since then. Local business leader James Morrison passes away at 82. The words hit him like a punch to the stomach every time he saw them. Jimmy Morrison, his old war buddy, was gone. Harold made himself a cup of coffee and sat down at his small table. The apartment was quiet except for the sound of cars passing by outside. He thought about Jimmy and how different their lives had turned out. When they came back from Korea all those years ago, Jimmy had used his military connections to get into business. He'd married a wealthy woman, bought a big house, and became someone important in the city. Harold had gone to work at the factory, married his childhood sweetheart, and lived a simple life. They'd tried to stay in touch for a while. Jimmy would call Harold every few months, inviting him to dinner parties or business events. But Harold always felt out of place. Jimmy's friends would talk about stocks and golf courses while Harold knew about shift changes and overtime pay. Eventually, the calls stopped coming. Harold never blamed Jimmy for it. People drift apart. That's just how life works, but seeing Jimmy's name in the obituary brought back all those memories from the war. Harold remembered the night they'd spent in a frozen foxhole, sharing a can of beans and talking about what they'd do when they got home. Jimmy had said he wanted to make something of himself, to build a life that would make his parents proud. Harold had said he just wanted to come home alive. The funeral was scheduled for Friday morning at Henderson Memorial, one of the fanciest funeral homes in the city. Harold had driven past it before but never been inside. He knew it was the kind of place where important people went to say goodbye to other important people. The thought of walking into that building made his stomach turn, but he had to go. Jimmy had been more than just a friend during the war. He'd been a brother. Harold finished his coffee and looked at the clock. It was still early, but he wanted to make sure he looked presentable. He went to the bathroom and carefully combed his thinning gray hair. His reflection in the mirror showed an old man with deep lines around his eyes and hands that bore the scars of decades of factory work. He wondered if Jimmy's family would even recognize him. The bus ride to the funeral home took 45 minutes. Harold sat in the back, watching the city change as they moved from his neighborhood to the wealthy part of town. The buildings got bigger, the cars got newer, and the people looked different. Harold felt like he was traveling to another world. When the bus stopped near Henderson Memorial, Harold could see the building from the sidewalk. It was enormous, with tall white columns and perfectly manicured gardens. Cars were already pulling into the circular driveway, expensive cars with drivers in black suits. Harold watched well-dressed people stepping out, all of them looking like they belonged there. He waited for a few minutes, watching the crowd gather. These were Jimmy's people now, business associates, politicians, military officers, with more stars on their uniforms than Harold had ever seen. He recognized some faces from the newspaper's business section. These were people who made decisions that affected thousands of other people. Harold took a deep breath and started walking toward the entrance. Each step felt heavier than the last. He could see people glancing at him as he approached. His suit, though clean and pressed, was clearly old. His shoes, though polished, showed signs of wear. but his medals caught the sunlight, and he stood as straight as his old back would allow. The inside of Henderson Memorial was even more impressive than the outside. The ceiling was high with beautiful chandeliers hanging down. The carpet was thick and soft under his feet. Flowers were arranged everywhere, and the air smelled like expensive perfume and fresh lilac. Harold had never seen anything like it. People were gathered in small groups, talking in hushed voices. Harold recognized the way they stood, the way they held their drinks, the way they looked at each other. These were people who were comfortable with money and power. Harold had worked for people like this his whole life, but he'd never been in a room with so many of them at once. He spotted Jimmy's casket at the front of the room. It was beautiful, dark wood with gold handles, covered in flowers that probably cost more than Harold's monthly rent. Above it was a large photograph of Jimmy in his military uniform, young and confident. The way Harold remembered him from their early days in Korea, Harold started walking toward the front, planning to pay his respects quietly and then find a seat in the back. But as he moved through the crowd, he noticed something. People were staring at him. Not the polite glances he'd gotten outside, but real stares. He heard whispers starting to follow him as he walked. An older woman in an expensive black dress leaned over to the man beside her. "Who is that?" she asked, not bothering to lower her voice much. "He doesn't look like he belongs here." Harold kept walking, his face getting warmer with each step. He'd faced enemy fire in Korea, but this felt different. This felt personal. He could feel every eye in the room on him, judging his clothes, his age, his right to be there. As he got closer to the front of the room, Harold saw a man in his 50s standing near the casket. The man had Jimmy's eyes and his strong jaw. This had to be Jimmy's son, Michael. Harold had heard Jimmy talk about his boy during their phone calls years ago. Michael had gone to college, then business school, then taken over one of his father's companies. Michael was talking to a group of important-looking people when he noticed Harold approaching. His expression changed immediately. Recognition flickered across his face, followed by something else, something that looked like embarrassment or anger. Harold was only a few feet away from Jimmy's casket when Michael stepped forward, blocking his path. The conversation in the room seemed to quiet down as people sensed something was about to happen. "Excuse me," Michael said, his voice carrying across the room. "I think there's been some kind of mistake." Harold stood frozen as Michael's words echoed through the funeral home. The entire room had gone quiet, and Harold could feel dozens of eyes staring at him. His heart was beating so fast he worried people might actually hear it. He looked at Michael, trying to find some trace of the little boy Jimmy used to talk about with such pride. "I'm sorry," Harold said softly, his voice shaking slightly. "I think you might be mistaken. I'm Harold Chung. I served with your father." In Korea, Michael's face hardened even more. He stepped closer to Harold, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. "I know exactly who you are. I've seen your picture in my father's old albums. But this is a private service for family and close friends." Harold felt his chest tighten. The room was spinning slightly, and he had to focus on breathing. "Your father and I were close friends. We served together. We saved each other's lives more times than I can count." "That was a long time ago," Michael said, his voice getting louder. "Things change. People change. This isn't the place for war stories and old memories." A woman in a designer dress whispered to her husband, "How embarrassing. How did he even find out about the service?" Her husband shook his head and looked away, clearly uncomfortable with the scene unfolding. Harold looked around the room at all the faces staring at him. Some looked curious, others looked annoyed, and a few looked genuinely sorry for him. But none of them stepped forward to help. These were people who knew how to handle business meetings and charity events, but this kind of confrontation was making everyone uncomfortable. "Michael," Harold said, trying to keep his voice steady, "I understand this is a difficult time for you. I just wanted to pay my respects to your father. We went through a lot together." "My father moved on from that part of his life," Michael snapped. "He built something important here. He became somebody. He didn't need to be reminded of—" Michael gestured at Harold's worn suit and old medals. of all that. The words hit Harold like a physical blow. He'd expected that he might not fit in with this crowd, but he'd never imagined being told that his friendship with Jimmy meant nothing. That the bond they'd shared in those terrible, cold months in Korea was something to be ashamed of. "Your father never forgot," Harold said quietly. "He used to call me. He'd tell me about you, about how proud he was of what you'd accomplished." "That's enough," Michael said, his face turning red. "I don't know what kind of stories you've been telling yourself, but my father had important friends. Real friends. People who mattered in this community." Harold felt something breaking inside his chest. Not just his heart, but something deeper. His dignity, maybe? His sense of belonging anywhere in the world. He looked toward Jimmy's casket, wishing his old friend could somehow stand up and tell his son what had really happened in Korea. Tell him about the night. Harold had crawled through enemy fire to drag Jimmy to safety. Tell him about the time. Harold had given Jimmy his own rations when Jimmy was too sick to eat the military food, but Jimmy was gone, and Harold was standing alone in a room full of strangers who saw him as an embarrassment. "I think," Michael said, raising his voice so everyone could hear, "that it would be best if you left now. This is a private gathering, and frankly, your presence here is inappropriate." Harold's legs felt weak. He wanted to argue, to tell everyone. In the room about the real Jimmy Morrison, the scared young man who'd cried in that foxhole, talking about how he missed his mother's cooking. But looking at Michael's angry face and the uncomfortable expressions of all the wealthy mourners, Harold realized it wouldn't matter. These people had made up their minds about who belonged and who didn't. "I understand," Harold said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll go." But as he turned to leave, Michael wasn't finished. "Security," he called out, waving toward two men in dark suits who had been standing quietly near the entrance. "Could you please escort this gentleman out?" The security guards looked uncomfortable, but they started walking toward Harold. The humiliation was complete now. Not only was he being kicked out of his best friend's funeral, but he was being treated like some kind of criminal or troublemaker. Harold's face burned with shame as the guards approached him. He could hear whispers spreading through the crowd. Like wildfire. Who is he? What did he do? Why is he being removed? The story was already changing as it passed from person to person. By the time it reached the back of the room, Harold had probably become some kind of dangerous intruder, one of the security guards. A younger man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else spoke quietly to Harold. "Sir, I'm sorry, but I need to ask you to come with me." Harold nodded, not trusting his voice. He'd survived enemy bullets and freezing temperatures, but this was different. This was his spirit being crushed in front of a room full of people who would never understand what he'd been through or what Jimmy had meant to him. As the guards began walking him toward the door, Harold caught sight of his reflection in one of the mirrors along the wall. He looked old and small and out of place. His medals, which had seemed so important when he put them on that morning, now felt like costume jewelry. Like he was playing dress up in a world where he didn't belong. The walk to the door felt like it took forever. Every step was accompanied by more whispers, more stares, more judgment. Harold kept his eyes focused straight ahead, trying to maintain what little dignity he had left. He thought about Jimmy's phone calls over the years. Had Jimmy been embarrassed by their friendship? Had he only called out of guilt or obligation? Maybe Michael was right. Maybe Jimmy had moved on and left Harold behind, just like everyone else from their old life. Just as they reached the entrance, Harold heard Michael's voice behind him, still loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm sorry everyone had to witness that. Some people just don't understand boundaries." Harold's shoulders sagged even more. Not only was he being kicked out, but Michael was making sure everyone knew it was Harold's fault. That he was the problem, the one who didn't belong. The security guard opened the door, and Harold could see the bright sunlight outside. In a few seconds he'd be out of this nightmare. He'd be back in his own world, where people knew him and respected him, where his service medals meant something. But as he stepped toward the threshold, as he prepared to accept this final humiliation and walk away from Jimmy's funeral forever, a voice cut through the murmurs behind him. "Stop right there. The voice was strong, authoritative, and completely unexpected. Harold turned around, wondering who had spoken. Harold turned around slowly, his heart still pounding from the humiliation he'd just endured. The voice that had commanded everyone to stop belonged to a woman who was now standing up from her seat in the front row. She was tall, probably in her late 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat style. But what caught Harold's attention immediately was her uniform. She wore a military dress uniform with more ribbons and medals than Harold had ever seen on one person. The woman's presence filled the entire room. Even without knowing who she was, everyone could tell she was someone important. The way she carried herself, the way she looked at people, this was someone who was used to being in charge and having people listen when she spoke. "I said stop," she repeated, looking directly at the security guards who had frozen in place. Near the door, they looked confused, unsure whether they should continue escorting Harold out or wait to see what this woman wanted. Michael, who had been looking pleased with himself just moments before, now appeared nervous. "General Sullivan, I appreciate your concern, but this is a family matter. We're handling it appropriately." So this was General Sullivan. Harold had heard of her, of course. Everyone who'd served in the military knew her name. She was one of the most decorated officers in the country, someone who'd broken barriers and earned respect in a world that hadn't always welcomed women. But Harold had never imagined he'd meet her, especially not like this. General Sullivan walked slowly toward the front of the room, her shoes clicking on the marble floor. Everyone was watching her, including Harold. The entire funeral home had gone completely silent except for the sound of her footsteps. "Family matter?" she said, her voice carrying a tone that made Michael take a step backward. "Is that what you call disrespecting a war hero?" Michael's face went pale. "General, I think there's been some misunderstanding. This man just showed up uninvited. He's not part of our social circle. He doesn't really belong here with people of our standing." The general stopped walking and stared at Michael for a long moment. The look on her face was colder than a Korean winter. Harold could see people in the crowd shifting uncomfortably, sensing that something big was about to happen. "People of your standing?" General Sullivan repeated slowly. "Tell me, Michael Morrison, what exactly is your standing? What have you done to earn the right to judge this man?" Michael stammered, clearly not expecting to be challenged. "Well, I run several successful businesses. I serve on charity boards. I'm a respected member of this community." "Ah," the general said, nodding slowly. "You run businesses. You attend charity events. How impressive." Her voice was dripping with sarcasm that made several people in the crowd wince. She turned to face Harold, who was still standing near the door with the security guards. "And you, sir? Please tell everyone your name and where you served." Harold's voice was shaky, but he managed to speak clearly. "Harold Chun, ma'am. I served in Korea with the 23rd Infantry Regiment from 1951 to 1953. General Sullivan nodded and turned back to face the crowd. "Harold Chun," she said loudly, making sure everyone could hear. "Some of you might want to remember that name." She began walking around the room, making eye contact with different people as she spoke. Harold Chun served 2 tours in Korea. He volunteered for reconnaissance missions that most soldiers wouldn't dare attempt. He spent months in conditions that would break most of you before breakfast, Michael tried to interrupt. "General, with all due respect, that was a long time ago. Times have changed. Society has moved on." The general's eyes flashed with anger. "Society has moved on? From honoring the people who kept you free? From respecting the men who bled so you could grow up safe and comfortable?" She walked over to Harold, who was still standing by the door looking confused and overwhelmed. "Tell me, Mr. Chun, do you remember the Battle of Heartbreak Ridge?" Harold's eyes widened. "Yes, ma'am. That was a difficult time." "I'm sure it was," General Sullivan said gently. "Would you mind telling everyone what happened there?" Harold looked around the room nervously. All these wealthy, important people were staring at him, waiting to hear his story. I don't like to talk about it much, ma'am." "I understand," the general said. "But I think these people need to hear it." Harold took a deep breath. His voice was quiet, but in the silent room everyone could hear him clearly. We were pinned down by enemy fire for 3 days. Food was running low and several men were wounded. Jimmy, Mr. Morrison, he was one of the wounded. Michael's expression changed as he heard his father's name. He was starting to realize this wasn't just some random old man who'd wandered into the funeral. Go on, General Sullivan encouraged. The medics couldn't reach us because of the enemy positions. Harold continued. Jimmy was bleeding badly from shrapnel wounds. He was going to die if someone didn't get him help. Harold paused, remembering that terrible day. I volunteered to crawl through the enemy lines to reach the medical station. The room was completely silent now. Even the people who had been whispering earlier were listening intently. It took me 6 hours to crawl half a mile, Harold said. I had to move slowly, staying flat against the ground. The enemy was shooting at anything that moved. He looked down at his hands. I made it to the medical station and led a team of medics back through the same route. We saved Jimmy and 2 other soldiers that day, General Sullivan nodded. And what did you receive for this act of heroism, Mr. Chung? Harold touched the medals on his chest. I was awarded the Silver Star, ma'am. The Silver Star, General Sullivan repeated, loud enough for everyone to hear. The 3rd highest decoration for valor in the United States military. She turned to face Michael, whose face had gone completely white. Your father never told you this story? Michael shook his head slowly. He mentioned the war sometimes, but he didn't talk about details. Of course he didn't, the general said. Real heroes rarely do. They don't need to brag about their courage because they know what it really costs them. She walked back to the center of the room, addressing the entire crowd now. James Morrison became a successful businessman after the war. He built companies, made money, gained social status. But do you know why he was able to do any of that? The room was so quiet Harold could hear his own heartbeat. Because Harold Chung crawled through enemy fire to save his life, General Sullivan sighed. Everything James Morrison accomplished after Korea, every business he built, every charity he supported, every moment he spent with his family, all of it was possible because this man risked everything to save him. Michael was staring at Harold now, seeing him completely differently. The old man in the worn suit wasn't some unwelcome intruder. He was the reason Michael had ever had a father at all. General Sullivan wasn't finished. And how do you honor this man's sacrifice? By having him thrown out of his friend's funeral like some kind of criminal? The shame on Michael's face was visible to everyone in the room. Several people were looking down at their feet, clearly uncomfortable with what they'd witnessed. General Sullivan looked around the room at all the uncomfortable faces staring back at her. The silence was thick and heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. She could see that her words were having an impact, but she wasn't finished yet. There was more to this story that needed to be told. What I've shared with you so far, the general said, her voice cutting through the silence, is just what's in the official military records. But there's something else. Something that James Morrison asked me to keep private until after his death. Michael looked up sharply. What do you mean? General Sullivan walked over to her purse, which was sitting on the chair where she'd been seated. She pulled out a sealed envelope that looked old and yellowed around the edges. Your father gave this to me 5 years ago with specific instructions. He made me promise to open it only if something like this ever happened. Harold watched in confusion as the general carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter in Jimmy's familiar scrawl. Harold recognized the writing immediately. Jimmy had always written with a heavy hand, pressing the pen deep into the paper. Your father wrote this letter because he was worried, General Sullivan continued, looking directly at Michael. He was worried that after he died, his family might not understand the kind of man Harold Chung really is. He was worried that you might judge Harold based on his appearance or his social status rather than his character. The general unfolded the letter and began to read aloud. To whoever reads this letter, if you are reading these words, it means I am gone and something has happened that required this story to be told. Michael's eyes filled with tears as he heard his father's words being read in the quiet. Funeral home. General Sullivan continued reading. I need everyone to know that Harold Chun saved my life not once, but 3 times during our service in Korea. The official records only show the Silver Star incident. But there were other times when Harold put himself in danger for me. Harold's eyes widened. He had no idea Jimmy had written about their other experiences together. The second time was during a winter patrol, the general read from the letter. We were caught in a blizzard and separated from our unit. Harold found an abandoned bunker and insisted I take his blanket because my coat had been torn by shrapnel. He stayed awake all night, keeping watch while I slept, even though he was just as cold and exhausted as I was. The doctors later said, I would have died from exposure if I hadn't stayed warm that night. The room was completely silent except for the sound of General Sullivan's voice reading Jimmy's words. Harold wiped his eyes, remembering that terrible night. He'd never thought of it as saving Jimmy's life. It had just seemed like the right thing to do. The third time, the general continued reading, was our last week in Korea. Harold took shrapnel that was meant for me. We were running to a transport vehicle when enemy mortar started falling. Harold saw one land near me and threw himself forward, pushing me out of the way. The explosion sent metal fragments into his back and legs. He spent 3 months in a military hospital because of wounds that should have been mine. Michael's face had gone completely white. He looked at Harold with new eyes, seeing the slight way the old man favored his left leg when he walked, noticing the small scars on the back of his hands that must have come from that explosion decades ago. But General Sullivan wasn't finished with the letter. When we came home from Korea, I tried many times to stay in touch with Harold. I invited him to my wedding, to business dinners, to family gatherings, but Harold always declined. He said he didn't want to be a burden, that he knew I had moved on to bigger and better things. Harold remembered those phone calls. Jimmy had been so kind, so persistent in his invitations. But Harold had always felt like he would be out of place in Jimmy's new world. The truth is, General Sullivan read, Harold wasn't a burden. He was my hero. Every success I achieved in my life was built on the foundation of being alive, and I was only alive because of Harold's courage and sacrifice. I tried to tell him this many times, but he never believed me. The general paused and looked at Michael. Your father wrote this next part specifically for you. Michael wiped his eyes and listened as she continued reading. Michael, if you are hearing this letter, it probably means you've done something too. Hurt Harold, I know you, son. I know how much you care about appearances and social status. I know you might be embarrassed by Harold's simple lifestyle or his lack of education. But I need you to understand something very important. The general's voice grew stronger as she read Jimmy's words. Harold Chin is worth more than all my business associates combined. He has a kind of honor and courage that can't be bought or learned in school. When I look back on my life, I'm proud of the businesses I built and the money I made. But I'm most proud of being Harold Chun's friend. Michael was crying openly now, realizing how badly he'd misjudged Harold and how disappointed his father would be in his behavior. But the letter still wasn't finished. General Sullivan turned the page and continued reading. I have tried for years to find a way to repay Harold for what he did for me. I offered him money, which he refused. I offered him a job at one of my companies, which he declined. I even tried to buy him a house, but he said he was happy with what he had. Harold smiled through his tears, remembering Jimmy's persistent attempts to help him over the years. So I have decided to do something else, the general read. I have left instructions in my will that Harold Chun is to be given my most precious possession, the American flag that was presented to me when I retired from the military. This flag represents everything I valued most in life: service, sacrifice, and loyalty. There is no one more deserving of it than Harold. The room erupted in quiet murmurs as people realized what they had just heard. Jimmy Morrison, one of the most successful businessmen in the city, had chosen to leave his most treasured possession not to his family or his business partners, but to the humble factory worker they had just tried to throw out, General Sullivan. Folded the letter carefully and looked at Michael. Your father also left instructions that Harold, was to be honored as a pallbearer at his funeral and given a seat in the front row. Michael was sobbing now, overwhelmed by shame and grief. He walked slowly toward Harold, who was still standing near the door with the security guards. "Harold," Michael said, his voice breaking, "I am so sorry. I had no idea. My father never told me these stories." Harold looked at the younger man with compassion. "Your father was a humble man, Michael. He didn't like to talk about the war because it brought back difficult memories for both of us." "Can you ever forgive me?" Michael asked. "What I did was unforgivable." Harold reached out and put his hand on Michael's shoulder. "Son, your father forgave much worse things than this during the war. Of course I forgive you." The entire room was watching this emotional reunion, many people wiping their own eyes as they witnessed the power of forgiveness and redemption. Michael wiped his eyes and turned to face the crowd of mourners who had witnessed everything. His voice was shaky, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "I owe all of you an apology as well. What I did today was wrong, and it dishonored my father's memory." He walked over to the security guards who were still standing awkwardly near Harold. "Thank you, but your services are no longer needed. This man is not only welcome here, he's our most honored guest." The security guards nodded and quietly left the room, clearly relieved to be dismissed from such an uncomfortable situation. Michael then turned back to Harold. "Would you please allow me to escort you to the front row? There's a seat there that my father specifically reserved for you." Harold looked around the room at all the faces watching him. Just 20 minutes ago, these same people had been staring at him with judgment and disgust. Now their expressions showed respect, curiosity, and in many cases shame for how they had treated him. "I would be honored," Harold said quietly, Daz. Michael led Harold toward the front of the funeral home. Something amazing started to happen. People began standing up. Not all at once, but slowly, one by one, the mourners rose to their feet. It started with an elderly man in a military uniform who Harold didn't recognize. Then a woman near the back stood up. Then another person and another. Soon the entire room was standing in respect as Harold walked to his seat. Some people were clapping softly. Others just stood in silence, acknowledging the hero they had failed to recognize earlier. Harold felt overwhelmed by the sudden change. His legs were shaking, and he was grateful when Michael helped him sit down in the chair that had been waiting for him all along. There was indeed a small placard on the seat that read, "Harold Chun, Brother-in-Arms." General Sullivan returned to her seat next to Harold. She leaned over and spoke quietly to him. "Your friend Jimmy would be very proud right now. He always said you deserved more recognition than you got." Harold looked up at Jimmy's photograph above the casket. In the picture, Jimmy was young and strong, wearing his military uniform with pride. Harold remembered the day that photo was taken, just before they shipped out to Korea. They had been so young then, so excited to serve their country. With no idea what they would face together, the funeral service began, and it was completely different from what Michael had originally planned. Instead of focusing only on Jimmy's business achievements and social contributions, people began sharing stories about his character, his loyalty, and his dedication to the men he had served with. An older veteran who had served in Vietnam stood up and said, "I never served with James Morrison, but I heard stories about him from other soldiers. They all said the same thing. He was the kind of man you could count on, no matter what." A woman who had worked at one of Jimmy's companies shared how he had always made time to attend funerals for any employee's family member who had served in the military. He said it was the least he could do to honor people who had sacrificed for their country. As the stories continued, Harold began to understand something he had never realized before. Jimmy hadn't forgotten about their friendship or their shared experiences. Instead, he had carried the lessons he learned in Korea into every part of his civilian life. When it came time for the eulogy, Michael stood up and looked directly at Harold. "I had prepared a speech about my father's business accomplishments and community involvement. But after what I've learned today, I realize I need to talk about something more important, the kind of man my father really was." Michael's voice grew stronger as he continued. "My father was shaped by his experiences in Korea, especially by his friendship with Harold Chun, the courage Loyalty and selflessness that Harold showed during the war became the foundation for everything my father built afterward. Harold listened in amazement as Michael shared stories he had never heard before. How Jimmy had quietly paid for the college education of several veterans' children. How he had created jobs at his company specifically for military veterans who were having trouble finding work. How he had donated money to help build a memorial for Korean War veterans in the city park. My father did all of these things, Michael said, because he wanted to honor the sacrifice and service of people like Harold Chun. He couldn't save lives on a battlefield like Harold did, but he could use his success to help other veterans and their families. When Michael finished speaking, he walked over to a table near the casket where a folded American flag was displayed in a wooden case. Harold recognized it immediately as the flag Jimmy had mentioned in his letter, the one he had received when he retired from military service. "Harold," Michael said, carrying the flag case over to him, "my father wanted you to have this. He said it belongs with someone who truly understands what it represents." Harold's hands trembled as he accepted the flag. The case was heavier than he expected and beautifully crafted from dark wood. Through the glass he could see the flag was perfectly folded in the traditional triangle, with just the blue field and white stars visible. "Thank you," Harold whispered, clutching the case to his chest. "This means more to me than you could ever know." But the surprises weren't over. Yet General Sullivan stood up again and addressed the crowd. "I think it's appropriate that Harold serve as one of the pallbearers for his friend's funeral. Jimmy specifically requested this in his instructions." 6 men came forward to serve as pallbearers, including Michael and several of Jimmy's business associates. But they all waited respectfully for Harold to take his position at the front corner of the casket. The position of honor as they lifted Jimmy's casket and began the slow walk out of the funeral home. Harold felt a sense of closure he hadn't expected. He was finally able to say goodbye to his friend properly, with the dignity and respect that their friendship deserved. The procession to the cemetery was unlike anything Harold had ever experienced. Word about what had happened at the funeral home had somehow spread, and people lined the streets to watch the procession pass. Many of them were veterans who had heard about Harold's story and wanted to show their respect at the cemetery. As they lowered Jimmy's casket into the ground, Harold placed a small Korean War service pin next to the flowers on top. It was a pin he had carried in his wallet for over 60 years, planning to give it back to Jimmy someday when they met again. After the service, something unexpected happened. People began approaching Harold, wanting to shake his hand and hear more of his stories. Veterans from other wars, family members of servicemen, and even some of the business associates who had ignored him earlier all wanted to talk with him. A reporter from the local newspaper asked if she could write a story about what had happened. "People need to hear about this," she said. "They need to understand what real heroism looks like." Within a week, Harold's story was everywhere. The local news stations picked it up, then national networks. Social media posts about the funeral hero were shared thousands of times. But more importantly, Harold began receiving letters from veterans and their families all across the country. One letter came from a young soldier who was struggling with depression after returning from overseas. "Reading about your story gave me hope," he wrote. "It reminded me that my service matters even if nobody seems to notice." Another letter came from an elderly woman whose husband had died without ever talking about his war experiences. "Your story helped me understand why my husband was the way he was," she wrote. "Thank you for helping me see him as the hero he was." Harold kept every letter, reading them over and over in his small apartment. For the first time in his life, he felt like his service and his sacrifices had been truly recognized and appreciated. The American flag that Jimmy had left him sat in a place of honor on Harold's mantelpiece, next to the photograph of young soldiers standing together in the mud. But now, when Harold looked at that picture, he didn't just see the past. He saw a legacy of friendship, courage, and honor that would continue to inspire people for generations to come.